Back, what if you could decide at the end of your life when and where your death would take place? That question is at the center of the ongoing conversation around assisted death in Canada, and it's also the focus of our next guest's new book.
Dr. Stefanie Green was one of the first physicians in the country offering medical assistance in dying when it became legal in 2016. She has since become a leading advisor on this subject. Her new book is entitled This is Assisted Dying, a doctor's story of empowering patients at the end of life. She joins us now from Vancouver Island to talk about it. Welcome to The Social, Dr. Green.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot of people might be tuning in going, okay, this kind of is a morbid conversation. And in fact, though, you say that isn't the way you are approaching your work or how you approached your book. So how do you see it?
Well, obviously, medical assistance in dying has to do with end of life. And when someone's dying, when there's suffering involved, it can be sad, it can be tragic. There's a lot of emotion. But what I have found is that when I tell someone that they have the eligibility for an assisted death, once they know that that's true, they stop worrying about end of life. They stop worrying about how their life will end and the fear of the unknown. And what I've seen is that they really grab on to the last few days or weeks or even months of their life and really live it with intention, with meaning, and making it with purpose. It's really about how they want to live and what brings meaning to their life. And I find in that way, assisted dying is as much about life as it is about end of life.
Well, your book dispels so many myths about assisted dying, including the reasons why people tend to seek it out in the first place. So what are the most common reasons that patients actually do seek out your help in this way?
Yeah, when I first started this work, I thought it would be primarily because of physical pain and suffering, but that's not what I found. I found the majority of people come and seek out my care because they've lost what it is that brings meaning to their life. They've lost the things that have brought joy to them. They've lost the ability to function as a spouse, as a sibling, as a child sometimes. The role that they used to give into the community is no longer available to them. So there's a certain amount of emotional and psychological suffering that has brought them forward, sometimes because of physical suffering, but more often than not, it's more than that.
And some of the most intimate moments in your book are when you describe the gathering of loved ones during the actual procedure. And while they might not always wish, obviously, for their loved one to die in this way, a lot of them do end up standing by their side when the time comes. And I know this from a personal experience, someone that I know that did have an assisted death, and that, in fact, was very much the sentiment. So you actually speak with a lot of family in your book after the fact as well. So what is it that you hear from them at that point?
Sure. I find on the day of the actual death that the patients themselves are quite at peace. They're quite ready. And final words tend to be about, I need to get this done. They're quite settled. But the family, of course, as you pointed out, they are really grieving this loss. And there's a lot of confusion on that day. There's a relief that their loved one will not be suffering anymore. There's sometimes some guilt that they couldn't have found a better way for them. There's a lot of confusion about those emotions. So after the event, I find families are a little bit stunned. Despite all the planning that's gone into this, there's a lot of just stunned silence. And so it's really important to debrief with families, to speak with them, to give them the space to explore what they're feeling and to support them through this rather unique experience.
One of the things you address in the book is how you see the physician's role in providing medically assisted deaths. Some within the medical community have a really hard time with this, and they think that their role is strictly to expand or extend life. How do you see it?
Yeah, I don't see it necessarily that way. I think a lot of us who go into medicine do it because we want to help people. That's really the essence of why we go into medicine. And it's true that sometimes we can diagnose problems and treat problems and even cure problems. But we see people throughout the entire roller coaster that life is, all the way from birth to death and all the crazy twists in between. People will often come to us at some of the most vulnerable and difficult times in their lives. And while I'd like to think we can offer diagnosis, treatment, and sometimes cure, really what we mostly do is care for people. So, and there are times when that happens, when we can't actually find the relief that they'd like, or we can't care for them in a way that we would hope. And in those circumstances, we always comfort people. So we cure sometimes, we care often, but we comfort always. And death and dying are a part of life's spectrum. And so I think we should recognize it as such. And it's very much the place of a physician or nurse practitioner to be involved in that end-of-life experience with patients. I see it very much not different than what physicians do.
Which is really interesting because as I ask this next question, your work has been largely supported, but you also say that you probably receive the most resistance from within the medical community itself. And you detail how some physicians, they're forced to have consultations with patients like in these, hidden places, bus shelters, cafes, or street corners. Why? Because their hospital might not actually be supporting medically assisted death. So are you and other physicians who are still doing this work, is the resistance the same today, or has the conversation evolved even within the medical community?
Well, I do think there has been evolution. I do think patients have demanded that. The Canadian public is strongly in favor of this care and has embraced it and been very thankful for it. They've often dragged some of their own clinicians into the topic. And I do see an evolution within a number of different medical communities. But I am sad to say that there are still pockets of significant resistance. Some of that is coming from faith-based facilities with a different, perhaps, moral compass than the majority of people. But I'm sorry to say there are still facilities that are taxpayer funded, that are public facilities that are simply trying to opt out of providing this care. And I think Canadians would be upset to know that that's happening. And I don't think that they will allow that to continue. And if policy doesn't change that on its own, I expect, as has been the case in all of the change in assisted dying in this country, I expect on the backs of patients and their families, there will be a challenge to that, perhaps a court challenge. And I don't think that will stand up. I think Canadians will demand better.
So the pandemic, as we know, has impacted all areas of society. The healthcare system, of course, has been impacted. So what are some of the ways the pandemic has directly impacted medically assisted aid in dying?
Sure. I think at the beginning we were concerned that maybe people who had COVID might be reaching out for aid in some sort of urgent circumstance. That hasn't really been proven true. There's a whole rigorous system around assisted dying that needs to be fulfilled. Really, that's a place where excellent palliative care can be of most help. But I think where COVID has made its biggest impact is in the event itself, the scheduled death, what I call a delivery. Those events traditionally have been very intimate events with family and loved ones focused around the patient, often touching them or holding them. I'm often holding the hand of my patient, often in close, whispered words of goodbye. And very unfortunately, because of COVID, we've had to change the nature of that. I arrived, my team, my nurse and I arrived with masks on, with gloves on, sometimes with gowns on. We have to have conversations with family and loved ones from 6 feet away or outside on a patio where we're outdoors. The ambiance has changed, the event itself. And of course, that's always changing depending on the pandemic and the current public health rules. But that's really where I've seen the biggest difference.
So the vast majority of people still feel really uncomfortable talking about death or thinking about it, what's going to happen at the end of life. So what do you hope people will take away from this book when it comes to their own conversations about death and dying, whether with themselves or with their loved ones?
Yeah, I hope that this book can help contribute to the conversation about death and dying and end-of-life options. There are many end-of-life options. This is but one. I hope that this book can actually encourage people to think about what is meaningful in their lives. What is it that brings joy to them? If they project themselves into these situations, which I know we all do, just internally have that honest conversation. And then, of course, hopefully you'll be able to transfer that conversation out to a loved one so that decisions don't need to be made in emergency, but you've already had some exploration about that. I think it doesn't matter whether you believe in assisted dying or not. I think if this book can facilitate those conversations, then I'll feel that it's successful.
Oh, wow. What a really fascinating and eye-opening conversation. Dr. Green, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for your time.
The book is entitled This is Assisted Dying. You can find it everywhere now.